For more than 2 decades, Carl Anthony Payne II stayed quiet while the world laughed, quoted catchphrases, and celebrated a sitcom legacy that never told the full truth. Behind the jokes, behind the loyalty, behind the smiling face of Cole Brown, there was a story of fear, silence, and lines crossed that no one wanted to confront. Payne watched a cultural phenomenon rise while something far darker unfolded off camera. Now, at a point in life where silence no longer protects anyone, Carl Payne is finally speaking, not to destroy a legacy, but to explain why it collapsed from the inside. Before the break, who Carl Payne was before Martin. Long before America knew him as Cole Brown, Carl Anthony Payne II was building a discipline that most sitcom actors never had. Born on May 24, 1969, in Clinton, South Carolina, his earliest training was not comedy, it was control. Ballet, theater, repetition, and structure shaped him before fame ever entered the picture. He trained at All Children's Theater in New York, an off-Broadway repertory space known for demanding professionalism from young performers, then continued at Fiorello H. LaGuardia High School of Music and Art, and later Howard University. This mattered because Carl did not enter television as a reckless improviser. He entered it with boundaries. His first national exposure came through The Cosby Show, where he played Walter Cockroach Bradley. At the time, that role looked like a gift. In reality, it became his first lesson in power. The conflict was not loud, not public, and not dramatic. It was about control. Bill Cosby wanted to dictate Carl's appearance, down to his hair. Carl refused. Not out of ego, but principle. For him, image was identity, and identity was not negotiable. The refusal cost him the role. His character was quietly written out. And just like that, the industry showed him how quickly opportunity disappears when you challenge authority. That moment changed how Carl moved through Hollywood. He learned that success was conditional, and protection only applied to certain people. Instead of becoming bitter, he became careful. He carried that lesson into every audition, every set, and every relationship. So when he was cast in Martin, he did not arrive naive. He arrived observant. When Martin premiered, it was immediately clear this show was different. It was loud, unapologetic, black, and dominant in ratings. At the center was Martin Lawrence, already a rising force from stand-up and television. Carl's role as Cole Brown worked because it balanced Martin's energy. On screen, the chemistry felt natural. Off-screen, however, Carl noticed something early. Success was changing the hierarchy faster than anyone admitted. At first, things were functional. The cast worked, joked, and built momentum. But as ratings climbed, the structure shifted. Martin Lawrence was no longer just a lead actor. He was the executive producer. Decisions stopped being collaborative. Authority consolidated. And Carl, who lived by a personal code shaped by Harlem and discipline, started noticing behaviors that made him uneasy, not as an actor, but as a man trying to survive a workplace that was quietly becoming unsafe. This was not about jealousy. It was not about women. It was not about competition. It was about respect, power, and the early warning signs of something unraveling. Carl Payne understood early what many would only realize years later. When fame accelerates unchecked, accountability disappears first. And once that happens, no amount of laughter can stop what comes next. When power took over, the shift that changed everything. As Martin continued to dominate ratings, the atmosphere on set began to change in ways that were subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Carl Anthony Payne II has been clear about this. The problem did not begin with a single explosion. It began with distance. Martin Lawrence stopped being just another actor sharing the grind. He became the center of the machine, executive producer, star, untouchable. Carl noticed the shift in behavior long before the public ever did. Days that once felt collaborative became tense. Simple conversations turned unpredictable. The rules were no longer consistent, and the mood on set depended entirely on one person's state of mind. Carl later explained that Martin was dealing with internal battles that no one around him could fix. Fame amplified everything: ego, insecurity, paranoia, and volatility. And because the show depended on him, those behaviors were tolerated. The network's position was clear, even if it was never stated out loud: protect the star. Preserve the ratings. Everyone else adapts. Carl found himself walking a professional tightrope. Do the work, deliver the laughs, and stay out of the blast radius. But that became harder as Martin's authority grew. According to Carl, the respect between them slowly eroded. He began to feel undermined, spoken to differently, treated as expendable rather than essential to the show's success. What made the situation worse was the silence. No meetings, no mediation, no intervention. The system functioned as if nothing was wrong, even as the environment grew increasingly unstable. Carl described it as watching someone unravel in real time while being powerless to intervene. The pressure to perform never stopped, but the emotional safety did. This was no longer just a difficult workplace. It was a hostile one. Carl lived by a personal code shaped by his upbringing. Respect is non-negotiable, and threats cross a line. When behavior escalated to the point where he felt uneasy even off set, he knew something fundamental had broken. This was not a creative disagreement. It was about boundaries, control, and survival. Still, Carl stayed. Not because it was easy, but because he believed in the work. He believed in the cast, and he believed that what they were creating mattered to millions of people watching at home. What he did not know then was that the worst was still coming, and that the moment that would finally end, Martin was already in motion. The point of no return, when everything finally broke. By the time Martin reached its later seasons, the tension that Carl Anthony Payne II had been quietly enduring was no longer contained behind closed doors. What had been whispered for years finally exploded into public view through Tisha Campbell's lawsuit. And for those who were actually there, this was not a surprise. It was the moment everything they feared became undeniable. Tisha Campbell accused Martin Lawrence of sexual harassment, unwanted touching, verbal abuse, and creating a hostile work environment. According to her filing, the behavior escalated over time, becoming more aggressive as the show grew more successful. She described a workplace where intimidation replaced professionalism, where fear replaced trust. The lawsuit was eventually settled out of court, but the settlement did not undo the damage. It only confirmed how serious the situation had become. For Carl Payne, this was the breaking point. He has said openly that by this stage, the environment was no longer just uncomfortable, it was unsafe. Cast members were no longer treated equally. Power had concentrated in one place, and the network's response was to shield that power. The message was clear. The show mattered more than the people making it. Behind the scenes, the fallout was immediate. Tisha refused to work directly with Martin Lawrence. Scripts were rewritten, scenes were blocked to keep them apart. In the final season, their characters rarely appeared together, a strange and noticeable absence that viewers felt, even if they didn't fully understand why. The heart of the show was gone, replaced by careful choreography designed to avoid further conflict. Carl watched the collapse with a sense of grim inevitability. Years of instability had finally reached the surface, and there was no way to pretend anymore. Whatever joy Martin once carried had been overshadowed by fear, legal threats, and emotional exhaustion. When the show ended, it did not feel like a creative decision. It felt like an emergency exit. And when the cameras finally stopped, something else ended too. The relationship between Carl Payne and Martin Lawrence. They would not speak again for nearly 20 years, not because of pride, but because some wounds once exposed do not close easily. The silence after the laughter, 20 years apart. When Martin ended, The public assumed the cast simply moved on. What actually followed was a long, uncomfortable silence, especially between Carl Anthony Payne II and Martin Lawrence. They did not argue publicly. They did not trade insults in interviews. They simply stopped existing in each other's lives. For nearly 20 years, there was no contact at all. For Carl, that silence carried weight. Everywhere he went, people wanted to celebrate the show. They wanted stories. They wanted laughter. What they didn't want was the truth. Carl understood early that speaking out too soon would only make him look bitter, or worse, disloyal. So he stayed quiet, even as rumors spread and assumptions hardened. That decision came at a cost. Work after Martin was not guaranteed. The industry has a short memory when you are no longer attached to a hit, and Carl was suddenly navigating a landscape without protection. He continued acting, took guest roles, explored theater, and eventually moved behind the camera. But there was a period where the stability simply wasn't there. At one point, Carl stepped away from acting altogether and sold cars to support his family. It wasn't a fall from grace, it was survival. What hurt most wasn't the financial struggle. It was watching the legacy of Martin grow while knowing how broken the ending truly was. Carl had given years of loyalty, professionalism, and restraint. He had absorbed disrespect without retaliation. And still, he carried the narrative quietly while others rewrote history. The silence finally broke because of loss. When Tommy Ford passed away, grief did what success never could. It forced everyone into the same room again. Carl was there at the hospital. He had spoken to Tommy regularly. This wasn't nostalgia. It was real friendship. Tommy's funeral became the first time the cast shared space in decades. Carl described it as surreal, like stepping back onto a set that no longer existed. In that moment, old anger felt small compared to mortality. The silence between Carl and Martin finally cracked, not through confrontation, but through shared loss. And for the first time in 20 years, healing became possible, even if the scars remained. Why he spoke now: healing without erasing the truth. The reconciliation between Carl Anthony Payne II and Martin Lawrence did not arrive with a dramatic showdown, a tearful speech, or a carefully staged apology. It unfolded the way real healing often does, slowly, unevenly, and without guarantees. For years, there was nothing but distance. Then came the death of Tommy Ford, and with it, a reckoning that no amount of success could delay any longer. Conversations resumed, not to relitigate old arguments, but to acknowledge time, how much of it had been wasted, and how deeply silence had damaged everyone involved. Carl has been deliberate in explaining that forgiveness does not require amnesia. Reuniting does not mean rewriting history or minimizing harm. When the reunion finally happened, it was not designed to rehabilitate reputations or revive a brand. It was an admission of survival. A recognition that the people who created something iconic also endured something painful. Carl has said the experience was cathartic, not because it erased the past, but because it allowed honesty to exist without yelling, without fear, and without anyone needing to win. So why speak now, after so many years of restraint? Because perspective changes when fear disappears. Carl is no longer a young actor dependent on industry approval or worried about being labeled difficult. He is a husband, a father, a mentor, and a man who already absorbed the cost of staying quiet. He raised a family, including Bobby Brown's biological son, Landon, guided young artists through mentoring and film programs, and built a life rooted in stability rather than proximity to power. Silence once felt necessary. Now it feels dishonest. Carl has also watched the legacy of Martin slowly flatten into nostalgia. Catchphrases without context, clips without consequences, celebration without accountability. He understands something many industries avoid admitting. Legacies built on half-truths are fragile. They don't collapse loudly, they rot quietly. Speaking now is not an act of revenge. Carl has consistently said he wishes Martin Lawrence well and believes people are capable of growth. But growth, in his view, requires truth, not selective memory. He has never denied Martin Lawrence's talent or cultural impact. What he challenges is the idea that success excuses harm, that silence equals loyalty, or that pain should be buried to preserve an image. Carl has acknowledged that Martin was dealing with serious personal struggles during those years, struggles amplified and enabled by fame, money, and a system designed to protect its most valuable asset at any cost. Recognizing that complexity does not mean excusing behavior, it means refusing to lie about it. Today, Carl continues moving forward. He acts, directs, produces, mentors, and speaks openly about lessons learned the hard way. His work on projects like Binge to Death and Young Dylan reflects a career rebuilt on independence rather than deference. His financial stability is the result of resilience, not protection. But more important than money is peace, the kind that comes from no longer carrying someone else's secrets. By telling this story, Carl Payne is not trying to tear anything down. He is allowing Martin to be seen in full, the joy, the brilliance, the damage, and the cost. And sometimes that kind of honesty is the only way real healing can finally begin. So after hearing Carl Payne's story, do you believe silence protects a legacy, or does it quietly destroy the people behind it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you think stories like this matter, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the truths Hollywood left out.